So a number of years ago, I was in a conversation with my mother, Sarah Stewart, whose maiden name is Scoville. And my name is James Hallett, and I'm the second son out of three boys in my family. Mark's my elder brother. I'm James. Brian is my younger brother. Michelle is the eldest sister. And my mother and I were talking, and she broke down and told me that her greatest fear was that she would abandon her kids, or that would be part of her life. And I thought about that. It was a very profound moment for me because abandonment was sort of this primal feeling inside of myself. And it really struck a chord that had been her greatest fear. So she and I began talking about why that was her fear. And what came from that was the discovery that there was this family tragedy and story which had left the family deeply scarred, and it left a black hole in the family lineage. And the story that my mother unraveled that day this was many, many years ago. I was in my, I think I was in my late 20s, early 30s. And the story was a story about my grandmother, my mother's mother, and her name was Beulah Scoville, but her maiden name was Beulah Griffith. And she had grown up in a small town near Forsyth, Missouri, Taney County, Missouri. And her parents were very poor. Her mother was younger and her father was older. And the names that we had, that we knew of, were Nettie was my grandmother's mother, and her father was named Benjamin Griffith. So Nettie and Benjamin Griffith. And we knew that that Nettie's family name was something like Vertebrook. And but beyond that was this black hole that my grandmother had no knowledge of, and also this great tragedy had happened. So the part of the story started with my mother's mother was the eldest of three children. And I'm actually blanking on the three kids' names. The middle child was a girl, and the young son was a boy. And what had happened was that Benjamin Griffith, as the story goes, had choked on a bone during a meal, or choked on something during a meal. And they had called for the local doctor. And the doctor apparently had been drinking that night. So he didn't come for hours and hours and hours. And by the time he came, Benjamin had choked to death. And so Nettie had been left alone with three children, very poor, and she had tried to raise the three kids herself. And in the story, as my mother told it, Nettie had actually, in a state of poverty, she had begun to work at a local hotel, and she had had some sort of romantic affair with a local person who came and stayed at the hotel. And her parents had rejected her when she brought the three children to them and said, "I need help raising these kids." And her parents, the Vertebrooks, had said no, and that the state of Missouri had actually, Family Services actually come and taken away the children, and that when Beulah came back, she discovered that her mother had killed herself. She had committed suicide. And Beulah had then, as the eldest child, had attempted to reunite her family. So she reconnected with her sister, and her sister, I think, had been adopted, but the family was okay with Beulah being in contact with her. But the young boy, that family had actually said to Beulah, I think that she had seen Beulah had actually seen her brother playing on the playground, and she'd gone to greet her brother, and the mother of the family had run up to Beulah and said, please don't interfere. This is our family now. He's not part of your family. And they had said to her, please leave. And so I believe the family had actually moved away. And it had been one of the great tragedies of Beulah's life that she had wanted to reunite her family, and that she had actually lost her brother. So one of the things that my mother recently said to me was that, and I hadn't known this before, was that her mother had said to her, please try and find my brother. So I took these stories and I thought about my own sense of abandonment, my own struggle, because my parents had divorced at an early age, and my brothers and sisters, we'd all been separated, and so as families do, we had passed on this feeling or this experience of abandonment. And I thought, if there's any way that I can reclaim the family story, I might in some way be able to heal the wound. So I began to do this research study, and I began to go on the internet and to look up census records and to try and puzzle and piece together more of the story and figure out what had actually happened, and to try and find the boy of the family who had disappeared from the family records, and try and also piece together who Benjamin was, who Benjamin Griffith was, and who Nettie was, and I as I began to piece together the census records, I made this discovery that there actually was a Griffith family. Now, census records are interesting because going back in time, census records have always been done by hand. So one of the issues with the census is that you have people who spell things differently, and you have people who make mistakes in their writing, and people looking at the census records who are actually typing it up will make mistakes in how they read the text. So one of the challenges of looking at a census record, it's not a simple equation of like you look at a page and you're like, oh, there's Joe Schmo and he's on this page. No, in fact, it might be written as Joe Smith. His name is supposed to be Schmo, but you can't read it, so someone else types it up as Smith. So then when you're searching amongst millions and millions of people in this country, you actually encounter the name Smith. And you actually have to puzzle it together and figure out that, well, 10 years ago, that was actually a Schmo family, but 10 years later, it was written as a Smith family, so maybe the census taker wrote it up wrong. So I actually had to look at the census records and decipher both the mistakes that the census taker was making and also the mistakes that the later editors were making. And what I discovered was that there actually was a family. There was a Griffith family, and in surprisingly, in 1910, the census record showed the family with 3 children. Now, what was surprising about that was that in my mother's telling of the story, she had thought that Benjamin Griffith wasn't the father of the boy. She thought that my great grandmother had gotten pregnant with the man in the hotel, and that this was actually the reason that the family had been rejected from coming into the Vertebrate household. But when I looked at the census records, it showed that Benjamin and Nettie had 3 children in 1910, which meant that that was, in fact, Benjamin's child. And it also revealed to me that that the 3 kids, that this young boy in the family would have actually probably known that he had siblings. Now, I wasn't sure about that, so I wanted to research further. The problem was that the 1920 census showed the family had disintegrated because the kids were put up for adoption, or Nettie had died, presumably committed suicide, and Benjamin had died in between 1910 and 1920, and the boy had been adopted. So what I did was I began to. My mother said that Beulah, my grandmother, had told her that she thought the name of the family was Big, or something like that. Biggs, Big. And so I began to research and look for a family in that area that had no child in 1910, but had a child over 10 years old in 1920. So I had to look at all the families that fit anything spelling like Big or Biggs, or and I actually found a family that had no child in the 1910 census, and had I believe a 12-year-old child, or somewhere around there, in the 1920 census. And I was thrilled because this actually fit the possibility that this might have been my great uncle. So I began to search that line, and also I began to research as much information as I could about that area, and I decided to contact the local library to see if they had any information. Now, my mother had told me the story of Beulah. Beulah and her sister had both wanted to find their brother, but my grandmother's sister had actually driven to this small town years later, and she had gone around the town trying to find any information she could about her brother. And she had mentioned the story of a doctor, and I believe she thought that that it might be that she had scared the local residents, because they may have thought that there was something about a lawsuit or some issue that she was going to bring, some kind of, she was dredging up some kind of dirt about the local community. And the other issue that my mother raised was that my great aunt had driven in a Cadillac, and so this woman from out, who they didn't know, drove in with a very expensive car, started asking all kinds of questions. So I thought, okay, well, I'm not going to take that approach. So I called the local library, and I thought to myself, all right, someone else has already tried this, so I'm going to try a different approach. And I called the library and said to the librarian, whose name was Roxanne Young, who is a volunteer genealogist at the the Forsyth Library, and I told Roxanne the story as I knew it, and I said, I don't have any more information about these people, but these are the names I have, these are the dates I have, this is what I've discovered so far through the census records. And I said, if there's any way you can help me, please help. And she looked at me and she said, looked at me on the phone, I imagine her looking at me. She said to me on the phone, actually, this is much more information than you realize. Most people have no names, or they have very little information. So she immediately began to look into their documents while I was continuing to do the census record search for the Biggs family. And Roxanne contacted me a while later, and she had found a whole slew of documents. One of them was a newspaper notice about Nettie's committing suicide. And she also found that there's apparently Benjamin Griffith was a local judge. And in those days, a person didn't have to, it's not the same idea of a judge that we have now. Someone who held that position of a judge was someone who was more learned or literate in a small, poor community. And that person might sit as the judge, even though they didn't have any legal professional training. But Benjamin apparently had written a great deal about his life. He had written stories about his life. He had written articles for a local newspaper. And which was interesting because my mother had remembered from her mother's stories that their family was very, very poor. That they had lived in a shack with a dirt floor. And so even though they were very poor, this man had sat as a judge, and he was literate, and he had written articles for the local paper. And so Roxanne actually sent me, this first package of notes that included a background of who Benjamin Griffith was. And I was in shock. He talked about his life as a Civil War vet, and his brother, who had apparently been a very well-respected soldier, who had earned different medals, and he had risen in the ranks. And he also talked about his grandfather and his mother, and his pride in his heritage. So suddenly I was confronted with a path through the haze of our past. And I learned in the documents that Roxanne sent me that we were actually the descendants of Benjamin Lundy, who is considered to be one of the fathers of American abolitionism, which strikes a chord of irony in my family, because my family, my father and mother went to Selma, Alabama, during the Civil Rights Movement, and actually, my father studied with Martin Luther King at Boston University, and my mother was good friends with Coretta Scott King. They were in the same book club together. My father was one of the first white ministers to travel down to the South to work on civil rights issues. And my father had always sort of lauded or held it over my mother that that his family had this great heritage, and that her family had none. And so here I was in shock that my mother's side of the family had quite an amazing heritage. So I asked Roxanne if she could find anything about the adoption records, because I also wanted to find, history is an interesting thing. There's forwards and backwards in history. So this path had opened back in time, but I also wanted to find what had happened forward in time. I wanted to continue the search for my great uncle. And so Roxanne began to look for documents, and she actually contacted a friend who worked for the, I think it was like one of the archives, and Roxanne told me that a huge flood had taken place a few years earlier in this area of Missouri, and many of the historical documents had been erased in this flood. And she said to me, I'm sorry to tell you this, but there's a really good chance that the rest of the historical documents have been lost. So she contacted her friend in the archives, and it may have been a few weeks, it may have been a month later. I received quite a big package of documents from Roxanne Young, and in those documents were all of the adoption papers. And they listed in detail how old the children were, who they had been, what family they were connected to, either whether it was a foster child or an adoption. It listed the amount of money the kids were given by the state. Now, the sad part of the story is that I also know that my grandmother was abused in foster homes. She had a very, very difficult time in foster care, and my great aunt had been in either a foster child or adopted, but by a very religious family. But she was not treated badly. There was a very strict religious family. But for the first time, I began to know something about the family that the young man had been adopted by. And that information confirmed that what I had found in my census research proved to be true, that the Biggs family had adopted him. The Biggs family had changed his name, and I saw the possibility of looking forward into the present, in terms of searching for this family. So it was quite exciting to get that information from Roxanne, and I began to search for the Biggs family, and I now knew the family names. So I began to search for that family, and a couple of sort of amazing things began to come forward. One of the most shocking things was that the man who turns out to be my great uncle and our great uncle is Wallace Biggs, and Wallace Biggs was a man who was one of the founders of the, I'm going to get the name wrong. It's the Journalism Society of Wyoming. I think he's one of the great founders of Wyoming journalism, and I went to a website that had a photograph of Wallace Biggs, and that for me was the first moment that I actually had my breath taken away, because when I saw his photograph, he was a spitting image of my grandmother. I think there's nothing like a photograph to sort of shock you into awareness. The image is so powerful. And it was at that moment that I knew that I'd actually followed the right track. And so I called the Wyoming Journalism Foundation, and I don't have my notes in front of me, so I apologize for my lack of specificity. I called this journalism organization in Wyoming, and I got on the phone and I said, I'm actually looking for research on Wallace Biggs. And the man on the phone, who turned out to be the president of the society, said, "He's my hero." And I said, "Oh my God, well, he's my great uncle." And I said, I'm trying to see if he has any, I'm trying to see if I can contact him, And the man said, I'm sorry to report to you that he passed away. And I felt a moment of crushing realism that I had not been able to find him alive. Um, but but then I asked, does he have any surviving family? And this man told me that that Wallace Biggs had come to a celebration with his daughter. And so I asked the daughter's name, and he said her name was Vicky. So I had a name of a living person connected to that side of the family. And so I began to search for Vicky Biggs. And I the reference that came up when I searched for Vicky Biggs on the internet was, surprisingly, it was a woman, Vicky Biggs Johnson, and it was on the Northwestern University website talking about graduates and what they were doing. Now, the story is full of all kinds of strange connections, and one of them is that I spent some time at Northwestern. My father was a professor at Northwestern. My older brother was not only a graduate of the undergraduate program, but actually went on to graduate school as a journalist at Northwestern. So Wallace Biggs was a journalist, and my brother was a journalist, is a journalist, and Vicky Biggs had gone to this school, and she had continued on and was at the Gila Medical Center in New Mexico, according to the website at Northwestern. So here I was in a very strange situation, because I thought to myself, okay, so here's this person, she's alive, she is the daughter of Wallace Biggs, who was adopted, and I don't know if Wallace Biggs knew. I don't know if Wallace Biggs told his family. What if she doesn't know? You know, how do I reach out to someone and say to them, your father who passed away was actually adopted, and you have this other family, and and introduce myself, and she might not want to know. So I sat on this for a number of months. I sort of stewed on it and talked to my wife about it, and thought about how to approach this, and I actually called a couple of times and left messages for Vicky Biggs, and I think I didn't identify myself. I didn't explain it, but I wasn't sure. I didn't want to leave a message saying this information, but I wanted to reach out in person, and later Vicky Biggs actually told me that she had heard these messages, and there was something about these messages that had sort of shocked her. I just left a message saying, "Hi, this is James Hallett. Please call me back." And normally when someone calls, you don't feel a sense of anxiety or shock, or but the messages had actually stirred her, and she knew there was something profound happening, which is interesting. So I finally decided to write a letter. And I wrote a letter to her introducing myself and talking about the research I had done and what I discovered, and inviting her to respond or communicate. So I wrote to Vicky, and I sent off a letter, and a couple of weeks passed, and I thought, okay, maybe this person really doesn't want to know this. And I finally did get a letter back, and it was quite a wonderful letter. And what followed from that was correspondence with Vicky and talking to her on the phone, and eventually meeting her with her husband in New Mexico. My mother, Sarah Stewart, and Al Stewart and myself, and my wife. We all went out and met Vicki Biggs Johnson and her husband. And Vicky told me that when she had gotten the letter, she had read the first sentence, and then she had put it back in the envelope. And she set it down next to her in the car. And she said there's something so terrifying and so monumental about the letter that she didn't quite know what to do. And she'd actually talked to her brother, and her brother had said, just read it. So she picked it up and she read it, and she said she was very moved, and also told me that her father had been searching for his sisters. He, Wallace Biggs, had always kept a photograph of himself with his two sisters. So I noticed the light is blinking. You know what that means.
Yeah. We're close to. We're probably within 5 minutes.
Okay, so Wallace Biggs had actually kept a photograph of himself with his sisters his whole life, and when his adopted parents had died, he had taken his family to Forsyth, Missouri, to try and find anything he could about his sisters. Now, the shocking thing, of course, is that his sisters had done the exact same thing trying to find him, and they had all failed. So Vicky said that this had been one of the great sadnesses of her father's life, was that he had not been able to reconnect with his family. So it really felt like a powerful healing to sit down and meet Vicki Biggs and her husband, and to see my mother and her cousin, talking for the first time. My mother and my stepfather, a year or two earlier, prior to that, had been thinking about moving to New Mexico, and they'd heard about this city called Silver City, and they decided to go visit Silver City, New Mexico, and they had gone there, and then they decided to move to Santa Fe. Well, unbeknownst to them, Vicki Biggs Johnson and her husband lived in Silver City, New Mexico. And we later learned, my mother and my brothers had lived on Burling Street in Chicago, a couple of blocks from the Children's Memorial Hospital in Chicago. And we also learned that Vicky's husband had been an intern at Children's Memorial Hospital, 2 blocks away from where my family lived. So the correspondences, of the family, and are quite shocking and striking. So at this point, I'm now continuing the journey to learn more about this man, Benjamin Lundy. And I'm about to head down to Forsyth, Missouri, to actually go to the library where these documents exist, A couple of years ago when I was doing most of the intensive research, Roxanne Young had said to me, well, there's a lot more information here. We have a lot more, there are many more documents. Benjamin Griffith wrote quite a bit more. And so I'm going down to actually look at that material and see what I can find to try and uncover more of the story.